codec and clothing. Wait, if you're looking for cellar, you're not in the right place. The cellar is always the lowest part of the room. No, just one room over. Was there anybody who was looking for lossless encoding? No. Really, it's quite pleasant. You should try it. We're at ACME. Welcome. Blue sheets are going around. Thanks to our memer here, Richard, and Matt Miller from Untitled Chapter Room. Any agenda bashing, let's bring it up so that they can see it while they agenda bash.
Yes.
That's right, because somebody had a plane to catch. So, all right. Do you want to bring up their slides? Okay.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, right.
Okay, so the main ACME draft and the CAA draft are what we did last fall. The ACME draft has been with us for over half a year, and we've had a new draft since the beginning of working with last fall for both of them. And we've got a bunch of new stuff.
Actually, I don't think everybody saw it.
It is. It's just not eating the mic. Why don't you sit in the center one there? I'll take this one.
Okay. So the main draft and the CAA draft are in working group last call. They've both had revisions since the start of working group last call, and we hopefully think they're both done and are going to verify it here. Then we've got a bunch of new documents that we've just adopted, and we're going to hear about them, well, not for the first time because we've heard about them in the virtual interim, but we're going to see them in the context of a face-to-face meeting for the first time today. So does anybody want to bash the agenda that was on the previous slide when we still had slides?
I started early, that was a mistake. I would like the order of the verse to be read. That's a hardware problem.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we're not still at open mic. It was didn't pass so quickly. Okay. So anyone bash the agenda?
So we already had the bash to bring Star forward.
Right. Okay. So let's get Star forward then. You're on. Come on up.
Good morning. I'm Yaron Sheffer. I'll be talking about issuance of short-term certificates, STAR. This was adopted in the last session, so now it's a working group document, and therefore I will start with a high level, but dive into the details and specifics next. So, starting at the high level, some of the motivation behind this draft is to be able to authorize a third party to publish a website. Our first use case is CDN. We started with CDN back in the lurk days, and there are additional use cases that we are looking at. Part of the motivation, of course, is to deal with the fact that revocation doesn't work, and it's much easier to stop issuance of a sequence of short-term certificates. Another property of this protocol is that no changes are required on the client side, and that's in contrast to other proposals that are being discussed at the IETF. Next, please. So we're talking of three entities. The name delegation consumer is the one who wants to be presenting your web content for you. The DNO is the one who actually owns the domain name and presumably some content. And then there's the ACME server that we all know and love. The working group draft covers the two pieces that are in red. So being able to request the star certificate, the short-term certificate from the ACME server, as well as the periodic retrieval of the certificate directly into the NDC. The third piece is the initial interaction between the NDC and the DNO, and that's a different draft that we pulled out of the original individual draft, and that I will discuss shortly later in the presentation. This is not a working group document today. Next. So going into the details of the protocol, what we've done is extend the order resource of the ACME protocol with three properties: recurrent, total lifetime, so the duration of the issuance process, and then how long is each short-term certificate, what is the validity time of each short-term certificate. This is backward compatible in the sense that if you don't implement these properties, the client will get back an order resource, get back from the post an order resource that does not contain these properties. The client should notice that and will probably just punt. There were comments on the list that days are too long, so I would like to hear other people on this point. Right now, this is specified. Both durations are specified as days. Next, please. The star certificates are all fetched from the one certificate endpoint. That's the same endpoint that we're using in today's regular ACME. The current draft says that the client can understand what is the remaining lifetime of the short-term certificate by looking at the expires header. It was noted on the list that this is at best abuse of the expires header and probably just incorrect. One thing we could do is just send the client to pass the certificate itself and so understand what is the expiration of the short-term certificate. Personally, I would like it to be expressed explicitly so that people can deal with it as simply as possible. And yes, this does create duplication of information. Yes.
Ted Hardy from the mic. Just a quick question. My understanding of the reason we wanted this was because some people felt like the response from the server might be to give you a certificate for a shorter time period than your initial request. Is that correct?
No, that is not correct, actually, because you should be, or at least the DNO will be getting back an indication of the server's preferred duration. So the server is allowed to modify the dates to cut down the total issuance and or to cut down or even to lengthen each star certificate duration.
Okay, so in the case where it has changed, then the certificate that you get back actually reflects the one that was actually approved by the issuer, right? And
yes.
So there's a potential silly state then if you actually include it somewhere other than the certificate where somebody else has had to parse it and put something in wrong. So it seems to me, although it's a kind of a pain to parse this or to extract it, it's by far the most deterministic answer.
I agree.
So I would suggest we just stick to that. Richard does not like determinism and would like to rise to oppose determinism in all things. No, let me get out of his way so he can actually say what he really wants to say.
So one question. Why do we need this special treatment? I mean, regular certificates are issued, they expire, you proactively renew them. Why do we need a special thing just because the lifetime is shorter? we might as well use the regular ACME protocol and get just a few hours or a few days of validity.
Presumably because it's so much easier to be in NDC here. All you need to do is to periodically fetch a certificate and install it locally. You're not aware of the ACME protocol. You don't have any certificate issuance, parsing, understanding, logic. You're just a dumb endpoint.
So we're skipping the challenges that are involved.
It doesn't see
any
challenges.
reference.
It doesn't see the ACME protocol.
Yeah, and for some reason, that's kind of why I got up to contradict Ted's need for determinism. I think it's worth having the expires here in kind of the interest of layer separation. If you've got this kind of certificate maintenance thing and its only job is to fetch updated certs and drop them in the right spot on the web server, it's just kind of a pain to have that thing parse the certs to find out when it needs to go get the next one. And in fact, we are changing the content of this HTTP resource when a new certificate is issued. And so if, say, you were caching this HTTP resource, you shouldn't cache it beyond the point at which a new certificate will be present at that resource.
So in Ted Hardy, pretending to be at the front mic. So in the case where the expires header and the certificate disagree, you could end up in a situation where it's dropped in something that has a period of invalidity, and you're just going to say that's an error. You shouldn't do that. If it hurts when you climb into the boiling water, wait for it to become tepid. And so, in other words, you just see that as a bug. And
yeah,
okay.
Yeah. One comment on a slide or two previous about the JSON, the way you're expressing the renewal. I think it would be good to think about. Right, we have some time properties in the order process right now where the applicant can express not before and not after dates. So we should kind of, one, be consistent with how they're expressing time and probably want to speak as much as we can in terms of absolute times, which is what those fields use, which obviously it's not going to account for this whole thing.
So the first one can somehow be
But you might do something like, instead of specifying how long I want this renewal to last, say, I want the last renewal not to exceed this date, right? You could do something like that.
What would you do for the period thing?
Less sure about that.
Okay.
I'm not proposing a solution here. I just think we need to be consistent with those, both kind of stylistically, and also we need to address the case when those are specified as well as these fields.
Okay.
Ben Schwartz. I don't claim to be an expert on this topic, but it seems to me that the classic solution here, the official standing solution is OCSP must staple, and which is defined in RFC 7633. I just looked it up. Must staple. So it would be great to have a reference to 7633. The draft just says doesn't rely on revocation mechanisms, but must staple solves at least many of the problems with revocation mechanisms. So it would be nice to know what the remaining issues are.
Michael Richardson. So I'm sympathetic, actually, very much to Richard's view that it would be nice to have the information outside the certificate. But I have another reason I think that's useful, and I think that maybe it addresses Ted's silly state situation. I'm not sure. I would interpret the outer expires as, don't come back and ask for me for something new before this date, because frankly, you'll be a pest, right? But frankly, the actual expiration in the certificate might be some hours or even significant portions of a day longer, because, well, you got to have time to go get it, right? So that actually may be two different pieces of information for two different layers. And so the outer expires really is, please start getting your certificate at around this time, your renewal at around this time. But don't bother before that time, because you just get the same object again, right? And I think that may be really useful.
Can I respond? So You're absolutely right. And the current version of the draft actually says that the CA should have the new one ready halfway through the duration of the certificate, through the validity of the certificate.
And if you ask, you may randomly get the new one, and that's
No,
okay.
so the expires value should be correct as per this.
But it should be ready halfway before
Yes.
the expiry. So I'm saying if you happen to ask during that second half of the period, you get a new you may get a different thing than you did before.
You will get
a different
thing.
but you said it should be ready. It might not be ready, and there may be caching that means that you don't get the new one. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah. So expires should reflect the actual resource that's available at the endpoint.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Ted Hardy, with a clarifying question to Michael. If you were going to design this and had a bike shed available, what color would you paint this name? Because it doesn't seem like expires is exactly capturing what you're asserting is the intended semantic, and that you've just said actually makes it even clearer that this isn't truly an expires header. This is actually, new e-tag will be valid on, or some extremely clunky way of saying that this is actually something for the next renewal available at.
Well, I know what I would say if we were last night at Pekachuka. I know what I would name it. I just don't feel like putting those words into the microphone right now. But, but don't come back until, something like that, except that maybe a few more words.
So something along the flavor of renewal available at.
Renewable available at. That sounds like a very nice sanitized version of what I was going to say.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think the clarification that this is actually not expires, but something else with a different semantic is very useful. Thank you.
From Stefan Essing, this is more for Michael Richardson. HTTP expires says something about how long the server will keep the resource unchanged, not necessarily how the content applies to some other protocol.
But this isn't actually that either, as Yaron just clarified, because it's supposed to be changeable within the half period.
Diego Lopez, this is reflecting somehow some discussions that some of the people that appear in the draft as authors have been having in the past, Jaron and Thomas and I. But I like very much this proposal from Michael in the sense that what we are distinguishing is between what is in the protocol envelope, and we're talking in the expires, we're talking about the protocol envelope, and inside the certificate, we're talking about the semantics of the certificate that is completely oblivious to what is in the envelope. That to me makes perfect sense, and it would solve a dilemma we had, and in the most reasonable way I can think of. So
Maybe we can move to the next bike shed.
Yeah, just one
Just
quick
one
last
more.
word on this. I would be disinclined to invent a new header for this because
Oh, really?
all we're talking about here is maintaining cache sync. Like, let's presume that the CA can update the will faithfully update the certificate before it expires, and so there will always be a valid certificate there. And in that case, all you care is that the servers replicate cache update rate. The rate of the update of the resource gets reflected on the server that's caching this. So it seems like there should be some way to abuse HTTP cache semantics into doing what we want here.
So just one more. This is Debbie Cooley from NSA. So I think you need three values. You need is available on and expire on. So you need the cert's going to be available on this date. You need the cert's going to expire on this date because that needs to go in the certificate. And then you need the drop dead date when you're not going to renew anymore because you're not changing the private key here, right? This is reuse of the public key to sign a new cert, right? So at some point you want to make sure that you renew that key. And so at some point, that's not too far.
I'm misunderstanding. You're talking about the initial request when I ask for the whole process to start?
Yeah, so you need
Oh,
three
okay.
values, right? Three
So
values.
start on and at and the duration of each certificate.
Yeah. So how often you want them available, what you want the expiry date to be, and then when you want to stop doing the automatic renewal.
Okay, so implicitly the start on was immediately, but perhaps
Well, right.
it makes sense to
So you don't need that. So whenever you supply it is whatever that is, right? But how long you want the certs to be good for and when you want to be able to collect them.
Yeah. Okay, next, please.
We're done with the colored bike shed thing.
If we're still bike shedding, then I think the perfect name for Michael's semantic is next update.
Not bad.
Yeah.
Okay. So first of all, a big apology. This shouldn't say revocation. This is about stopping misissuance, stopping reissuance. Sorry, too early. And definitely not about revocation. Right now, the draft has just a simple delete. Obviously, it needs to be authenticated at the application level, at the ACME level. Martin's proposal was to replace this delete with a post saying that I think the duration is 0 or something like that. My problem with it is that it would still leave an order resource out there with kind of unclear semantics. But then, of course, it would solve the authentication problem. Something else that I would like to put on the table is to convert the JWS into a JWT and just add a header, maybe an authorization header to pop it into.
So I think we've got a good design pattern with this, with deactivating authorizations and accounts. I think we can just copy and paste that here.
Okay, I don't remember. Can you say a word about what that is?
To be honest, I don't actually remember the details. It's some sort of request. You post a request object that has some special syntax in it that says, I would like to deactivate this thing. Deactivation being probably the right metaphor for this, or stopping issuance.
I think that's what Martin proposed.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, but anyway, uses the same authentication, uses a post as you say here.
Okay, fine. Next. Okay, so there's quite a bit of cleanup still needed to remove some of the old stuff from the working group document. We need to add a discussion of certificate transparency. We need to deal with the two issues that we've just discussed. There was mention of OCSP stapling, and so a better discussion of why this is needed / useful. But I think overall, there's little that needs to go. It's a simple protocol. So we are hoping for 01 to be published within the next IETF cycle and to be ready for working group last call. Next, please. So going back to the other one, to the blue arrow on my previous diagram, this is the part where the NDC requests the initial thing from the DNO, requests the DNO to initiate the ACME request to the CA. There are some complexities involved with that, and some serious security considerations. And to me, this is the main reason why I would like to see it also as a working group document. I think it's early for that. I'm not calling for adoption now to clarify, but I'd like the working group to think about it.
So just as a point of order, if you've actually read the document since it was split out, could you please raise your hand? Okay, there are a couple of people, 5 or so, but I'd really like to see folks have a chance to review this before we take up the question of whether it's going to be a working group item or not. So if you could, if your hand was not already raised, please arrange to raise it soon by reviewing the draft and commenting on the list. Thanks.
Next, please. And that's it. Thank you.
Can we have a backup memer since Richard will be taking the note, won't be taking the notes for this, or just somebody to take regular notes?
I volunteer John Peterson.
Michael, could I ask you to do it? You know this well enough. Could you just, if there are any action items that come out, thank you. Wherever you like.
Yeah, you can send them to me in Jabber. All right, ACME. I'm assuming that's applause for the slide art here. So we've had our second working group last call after we published a draft for this meeting. And I think based on that, we're pretty much done. The next slide has a couple of issues. We've had a couple of things come up on the mailing list, thanks to folks sending those in this week. All of these, I believe, are pretty editorial issues. And on the next slide, we've got some things that are in GitHub as of this morning. I think all of this is pretty editorial stuff. I mean, it may involve like diffs that are a few sentences long or maybe a paragraph long. So it's not completely trivial stuff. But I think all of this stuff is, I don't think any of it is making protocol changes, and it's all just kind of clarifications, maybe some like should to must tweaks that we can run by the working group as we're doing them, but I think we can get this all just sort of landed, and I don't think it'll be anything, well, obviously up to the chair's discretion, but I don't think it'll be anything that will require yet another working group last call. So I think we should be able to, on the next slide, just send this on to the IESG. Anyone think that, any objections to that plan? I think what I would target is in the next, say by the end of the month, trying to get some proposals out to the list for the fixes here, get some PRs up, give people a couple days to glance at them, and then land them and send it on by early mid-August. Thumbs up from the chairs, from the floor, from the AD. All right. He might. Yeah, that's why he needs the jetpack, so that he can convey the whole spec. Yeah. All right. Thanks.
Great.
Thank you, Richard.
See, we don't have slides.
Yeah, we have no slides. We have no presenter. CA.
Oh, no presenter.
No, he's not here. Okay. Well, we have people willing to talk. That's.
I was going to ask the question because that was sort of why I came, was to hear the status of CAA, because I couldn't really tell from looking at the mailing list.
Richard, you have the open issue, I think, right, on CAA?
Yeah, and it's actually kind of an open issue on ACME. So the question, aggressively swapping in as I speak here. The question raised on the list was that the CAA draft has a slot in it to describe what validation mechanisms are approved for use with the subject, the domain that is listed in the CAA record. And right now that's focused on ACME mechanisms, drawing on the registry that we have of ACME validation mechanisms. The proposition I made on the mailing list was that it might also be useful to use this for non-ACME validation mechanisms. For instance, the CA browser CA browser forum baseline requirements list several validation mechanisms that are approved for use in the Web PKI, but are not ACME mechanisms. And it could be useful, to make the CAA record useful more broadly than just for ACME, to have the ability for people to express those validation mechanisms in the CAA records as well as ACME validation mechanisms. So the impact of this would be mainly to change the token in the CAA record from ACME methods to validation methods, but the registry impact would be that we'd want to kind of track the tokens you're using for these non-ACME mechanisms as well as for the ACME mechanisms, so that you could be unambiguous. And so the ACME impact was that we might take the registry of validation mechanisms that's defined in the ACME spec right now and generalize that to a validation methods registry with a column that indicates whether this is an ACME mechanism.
So obviously that would require the cooperation of the CA browser forum to make sure that the registration of those tokens matched their expectations. Do we have any way of assessing whether their willingness to do that is high, medium, low, non-existence?
I think we have sufficient joint participation that could probably be orchestrated. I don't expect, I think that, like I said, that could probably be made to happen. The CA browser forum has been working on tightening up their list of validation mechanisms and being more restrictive on CAs. So it's something that is under work in that space. And so I would expect there would be appetite for aligning with this sort of stuff. They're also upgrading their CAA requirements as well. As of September, CAA will be required for all issuances. So these are both CAA and validation methods are things that are under current discussion at CA browser forum. And so it's not unreasonable for this sort of thing to come up.
So just as a second clarifying question then about your proposal, would you expect then that we would actually have this as a tuple that would indicate both the method and which registry it comes from, or are you actually expecting one of us to collapse the registry into the other?
As I think I made a pull request to ACME that made an explicit proposal, and I think the proposal there was to have a flat registry of validation mechanisms and then have a column there to say this is an ACME mechanism.
So that's the converge into a single registry theory. Yeah. And as long as everybody's okay with that, with a column that just indicates whether it's suitable for use in ACME or not, I think that's a fun idea. But we probably do need some confirmation from CA Browser Forum that they're not going to get upset at us registering their validation mechanisms in such a thing.
I also don't think the registry part of this is totally necessary. If you look at the way CAA is expressed, it's these precise values used in the CAA fields are left up to the certificate applicant and the CA. I think the expectation is basically the CA will express to the applicant what values it should put in there. And so you could conceivably get by with just defining the field in this document, not the values that go in that field. And if there's a need for interop at that level later, we could come along and specify perhaps a new registry that has some additional values beyond ACME methods that could go in that field.
So you have a couple of people behind you.
Paul Hoffman. So one of the reasons why I was asking about this is that I've just started following CA browser forum stuff more, and one thing I see, especially on CAA, is they're still wandering around. They know where they want to go, but for example, someone will put up a ballot about something, and people will start saying yes, and someone will say, "Oh, this is badly worded," and things like that. So if we're going to rely on them, I think we need to rely on a specific date. Say that we have the base requirements of a certain date or a certain version or something like that. Having said that, I think that this is actually a really good place where CAA Browser Forum is doing some reasonable work, that CAA is one of the most visible things that would work, especially with ACME. So it might delay things a bit, might make them take longer, but I think it would actually be a very good thing for us to consider.
Clint Wilson, Digicert. So one thing that I think the CAP form is working on is, obviously defining these 10 validation methods and very well defined validation methods that are allowed. But they're also trying to make sure that those sub items within the baseline requirements don't change. So these are all under 3.2.2.4, and then 1 through 10. So in theory, we should be able to just basically register those identifiers, or not even necessarily register the actual identifiers, but register the extension and have those identifiers map to all of the methods. In addition, for public CAs, it's going to be required to track the version of the baseline requirements and the method which of those sub-identifiers in the baseline requirements was used to validate a domain. So it might make sense to some extent coordinate that with the CAA records as well, since they have to track those anyway.
So just trying to bring this to closure, I think the question here is whether people think that the field we're defining in CAA here should be specific to ACME methods, or whether we think that it would be useful to have the ability to express non-ACME validations in this field. If the latter, then we can find a way to express it, I think.
Okay, let's take a hum on this point. So please raise your hand if you think you understand the question. Okay, this gives me a volume check for how loud a hum I should be expecting. If you believe that what we should be registering here are ACME-only validation methods, please hum now. Okay, if you believe what we should be registering here are validation methods which are valid for both ACME and for non-ACME validation methods, please hum now. Kathleen, check my work here. I believe that was a pretty strong hum in favor of. Okay, so I would call that unanimity of the interested parties for finding a method to include both ACME and non-ACME. So if you haven't reviewed the pull request that Richard already has on the CAA draft, please do so now. I will add that to my own list of action items since I don't think I've reviewed it. But please do so as soon as you can. Thanks.
Mr. Peterson.
Good morning, everyone. I've got a bit of a sniffle and head cold, so if I start coughing or sneezing or whatever, I do apologize in advance. But we're going to talk, nonetheless. We're going to power through this to talk about STIR and its exciting applicability to ACME. So what is STIR in the first place? STIR is this thing we cooked up over in that art area over there as an attempt to rectify the longstanding deficiency in the SIP protocol, largely created by myself, that you can't really authenticate like the source of calls. It's kind of a big deal. Turned out to be a big enabler for things like robocalling. A lot of robocalling actually happened starting in the SIP world and ending up in the PSTN world. That's kind of on us, so we got to do something about it. The best thing we can come up with to do, of course, is to have a cryptographic way to attest authority over the telephone numbers that calls seem to be originating from. For that, we need certs. For certs, we therefore created a draft IETF STIR certificates, which is in the RFC editor queue, I think, or it's auth48 or RFC editor queue now, I forget which. But this creates kind of two axes of extension to traditional X509 certs, one that lets you attest a list of telephone numbers, in some cases number ranges, that a cert is responsible for. And in other cases, these things called SPCs, which are service provider codes. Mary Barnes is going to talk about those in a sec. I'm going to drop those for now. But anyway, that's what STIR is about. We got to figure out a way to issue and provision these certs. Our best thought about this is to do it with ACME. Next slide. This is kind of what STIR looks like, just to give you a broad sense of it, right? We'll use some protocol like SIP from these user endpoints. Probably we'll have these intermediaries, right? These are like proxy servers, we call them in SIP, that'll have an authentication service built into them. Now, they're the entities that need to have the credentials in this. Endpoints may too, it'd be great if we had like an end-to-end story, and there's a few end-to-end things we're building for this, but a lot of this we imagine, because this is the way SIP is typically deployed today, is going to be done at these kind of proxy intermediaries. So they need to be able to get the certs. And then the intermediaries on the terminating side, the verification services and endpoints on the terminating side as well, need to be able to validate those credentials from whatever this logical authority is. Next slide. So, hey, that seems kind of like a no-brainer. Like we could just use ACME, right, to figure out whatever we think the right proofs would be, that you own a telephone number or these other resources that we're considering, and get those down to these authentication services where they need to go, then have certs storage so we can acquire those certs and validate them on the verification service side, right? Okay, next slide. So when it comes to TNs in particular, what are interesting proofs? Well, I mean, we've looked at a couple ways that you can do effective control sorts of proofs that, you know, we thought about, well, how do we do this for the DNS, right, in ACME? And there are things like SMS return routability, which are widely used today as kind of a two-factor auth mechanism. Obviously, because of their wide use by banking applications, they've been of special interest to adversaries these days, who have engineered a few ways to try to cheat this and to get SMSs routed in interesting ways out in the network. The SS7 network is not cryptographically secure in a meaningful way, where all this stuff takes place. So we got to be cautious about that. I think there's some belt and suspenderish things we can do, though, that will rely, at least in part, on automated tests like that. You can also like interrogate the operating system of smartphones to learn things about it. There are things about the SS7 network you can query. If you have access to carrier databases, you can ask the things that kind of track where your phone is connected to, important things like that, that might help anyway to get this all together. So we're kind of spitballing that a bit now. The other way to do this, of course, is through some kind of top-down delegation. Because in most jurisdictions, there are carriers, and those carriers are allocated large blocks of telephone numbers, and they in turn assign them to consumers and enterprises and everybody else like that. So we want to have a way that you can let a carrier attest, hey, for this number that I control, I've assigned this to this user or this enterprise. They should be able to come to ACME with some kind of token, get that, and redeem it for a cert for that TN. Wouldn't that be great? Anyway. We'll think about some other ways, I think, too. But next slide. So things we want to do with ACME. We love STAR. STAR's pretty cool. We want these things to be dynamic because telephone number assignment, unfortunately, is kind of dynamic. Like if you have an end user number, there are things like number portability that may move around, what carrier is responsible for it. So we need some agility in the assignment of these things. We'd love for them to expire and be renewed, probably at less than a day interval. At least for it to be possible for it to be less than a day interval. We want to be able to tweak that and figure it out. Today, obviously, I think from my reading of STAR, it is still very specific to the lurk use case. I mean, it has entities named in it like the DNO, the domain name owner, and really for that to apply to something like TNs, we need to have it slightly more generic than it is now. But in other respects, I think it's pretty much dead on. You know, I also, I guess, kind of wonder if there are ways other than delegation, which effectively assumes, again, that lurkish model that there's a domain name owner and then a CDN or whatever that's going to use it. If there was something more like proofs, you know, that are automated, like effective control sorts of proofs that could be built into the automation process, such that the ACME server actually, when it's going to reissue the cert, doesn't just check and see if the entity delegated from canceled your subscription, basically this cert, but instead it does the test again, right? Like for the DNS case, if it looked in the DNS every time it was going to auto-renew, it said, hey, is this actually still valid, right? So I think there might be things like that would be really useful for our use case in particular that we should talk about. But again, I think we have plenty of time to work out the finer details of that. Next slide. This one I'm largely going to defer, I think, to Mary's presentation as well, because she's kind of doing a lot of this token stuff for her model of how you get these SPCs, these service provider codes. But definitely, I think, I'm kind of surprised there is not already a generic mechanism in ACME that lets you say, like, hey, some authority over this namespace can issue tokens, and you can get one of those tokens and give it to, you know, Boulder and get back a cert for the thing that authority attested to, provided, again, that the instance of ACME trusts that authority. It seems to me like there's just probably a lot of use cases that could rely on a generic mechanism for that. So kind of, I am going to advocate after Mary gives her spiel on this, that we make that more generic as well here, because it just seems like a no-brainer that'd be useful. Next slide. I don't know if a lot of people here are like super jazzed about this use case. I think it's a really interesting one. There's a lot of interest from this from regulators and even some operators in North America. So, you know, this draft is still pretty exploratory. We're still trying to figure out what we think some of the proofs would be. But definitely happy to work with folks here on it. If anybody has any comments or questions now, happy to hear them.
John?
Yeah, thanks for the halls, I know. I feel tearful. Yes.
Hi, Petr Špaček, CZNIC. I have slight warning from the DNS planet because we tried something similar with enum, where basically, the hierarchy is that the carrier has control over the prefix, and then in theory, he could delegate or supply the records for the customers. But whenever you try to, get some piece of the cake, which is now carriers, he will refuse to do it. So enum failed horribly because the carrier didn't delegate anything for their customers, because it would mean that their customers could use SIP and basically avoid the carrier. So the problem is with the identifier is tied to the carrier more or less, and the carrier may not be willing to do anything with the identifier if it endangers his income. So beware of that.
I was there for some of that. I remember that stuff. That was pretty gnarly, I have to agree. I guess what the only ray of hope I can really offer for this beyond that is that this robocalling stuff has gotten a lot of people super pissed. Like, in America, like senators and stuff come to the FCC when we're there to talk about it and like yell about it because people call them all day and are like, why am I getting robocalls and can't you fix this? And that this has created tremendous regulatory pressure on carriers to get something that's actually going to work here. And as a consequence of that, there was never anything like that for enum, I promise. Like, I think I'm one of the largest enum operators still in the world, probably, right? And Neustar is. So, I mean, it's not like, there are still people who use it, right? In these little niche cases, this has overwhelmingly greater applicability and interest in the community than that did. And, some carriers, though, I'm sure, some carriers are not going to be eager to do this, and it'll be different in different jurisdictions. And I think there's a carrot and a stick to offer in this. We have a STIR approach as well that is almost entirely predicated on out-of-band mechanisms that don't need the carriers to buy in for them to work, because if the carriers don't want to do it, we still need to fix this, and we'll fix it.
Okay, yeah. Hopefully the incentives changed over time. So, thanks.
Well, I'm not a carrier, I'm Mary Barnes, but the carriers are interested in solving this problem now, and they're working over in ATIS and in the SIP forum. There's a joint task group called the NNI task group, and I can send the documents to the list for people that want to look at them. And I'm going to talk about something that's output from that group in a few minutes.
Jim Reed. Hi, John. Peter was saying that the enum approach was tried and failed in the past, and yes, that was certainly true in the public space, but enum has certainly been used inside telephone networks for things like call routing and stuff like that.
Yeah, there's like the GSMA Pathfinder thing, right, which is like routes mobile messaging. Like we do that for the GSMA. It's an enum instance, right? I mean, it's an enormous enum instance.
So we might not have to call it enum, but if we're going to go down the DNS path, we're at least aware of what the potential problems would be, and certainly resistance from the carriers for public enums to do with revenue protection, all sorts of other stuff like that. But certainly inside the telephone networks, this probably could be made to work, but we might be careful how we use the terminology of the language. But to my mind, it's a no-brainer. You've got a hierarchical numbering scheme based on E164. That reflects very nicely into the DNS. It seems like the obvious way to go.
Yeah, we could do that. I've thought about it.
Yeah, I just wanted to, this is Richard Barnes, I just wanted to clarify that the proposal, at least with regard to identifying how expressing telephone numbers in this document, is still to have an independent identifier type for telephone numbers, as opposed to mapping them into the DNS and treating them as DNS identifiers somehow.
Oh, definitely, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, that's true. Anything else?
Okay. How many people have read this document?
It's a thrilling masterpiece.
It's not bad. You should read it, you should comment, and then you can go back and tell your family that you're working to stop robocalls. I mean, it's a big deal, right?
They will give you a cupcake.
Excuse me, sir. No, not. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for the lead in there, John. Make this for short people. Okay, so I'm going to talk about how we're trying to solve this problem. Service providers are working with us. So we're defining a new identifier and challenge type here. Okay, so the changes since the last version, and we won't yet ask hands of who read it, but we didn't have, before we just had the new identifier there, and we had our new challenge type, and we didn't have a lot of detail on how it worked. So I've added those details and how it works within Shaken. And Shaken is signature-based handling of asserted information using tokens. Okay, we should have done bingo in here. So that's what it stands for. Okay, so what I did, we were kind of overloading, the key authorization field that's used for other challenge types like TOS, SNI, and HTTP. We're kind of overloading it because what we have is this token, and within the token, we actually have the fingerprint, which was what was being carried in the key authorization. And then this was part of, Martin Thompson's not here, right? But he had reviewed the document, and he had some comments about, we hadn't described the handling of how the server deals with this. And we'll talk a minute about his suggestion on why we're mixing TNs and service provider codes. Although that's a start thing. Okay, so this is our architecture. So in this, the STI-CA and the STI-CR are PKI CAs and CRs. The STI-PA, and this is what John was highlighting, we've got this policy administrator. And he's the guy that authorizes service providers to actually be able to get the certificates. Okay, and so this is what we've got, the service provider code token. Just to highlight, this is a logical architecture, right? So, but we've got a key management server, which is the ACME client. We have, secure key store for your private key, and then the usual CR. And then the STIAS and VS are the authentication service and verification service defined in STIR. Okay, so here's the the model for the account setup, getting the token, and then doing the ACME account registration. So this is where the STI-PA is the authority, if you will. And so he's going to process the service provider code. The service provider is going to set up an account with him. And I need my glasses to read that dang thing. Okay, so what the client's going to do is request the token. Excuse me. Okay, and so he's going to get the token, and then he's going to hang on to that, and then we're going to do our normal ACME processing. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so he's going to, do the normal application for certificate, get the authorization challenges, and then he's going to make sure he's got the token, and the token goes back in the challenge response. Okay. Well, hey, would you mind? I just want to emphasize here. And so in this case, the CA is going to go to the authority and make sure that the token in there matches one for that service provider, right? Okay, now we can go to the next one. Okay, so here is the format we have for the token. So we've got the algorithm type, it has to be JWT, and the URL to the STI-PA that's actually the validator. And then the payload, we've got, the only thing unique here would be the service provider code value. Now this is something that we could genericize possibly. Here I do want to highlight, so within our token, we actually have the fingerprint of the ACME account. And that's kind of, it gives us a little bit of indirectness, right? You've got your valid ACME account, you match that with whoever's sending ACME messages, and then you've got this token that the service provider signed. One thing is right now, we have the fingerprint being generated by the ACME client and then being sent over to the PA when he wants to get a token. We're not quite sure if that's the right thing to do, or we have the PA, the policy administrator, actually create that. So Chris, you want to bring that up?
Yeah, Chris Went, co-author. Yeah, since we have an indirect thing, while we were trying to model the HTTP approach, I sort of thought it made sense that during the account setup, or sort of out of band of the actual transaction of getting the token, you send the fingerprint to the policy administrator, and then the policy administrator stores that and then embeds it in the token when it's returned when the token is actually requested. So that's sort of the current thought. Looking for some feedback on that mechanism and whether that is actually the correct way to do it. But
I think it is, and he's thinking the other side right now. So, Ted, were you gonna?
Yeah, I just
okay.
Ted Hardy, quick question about code token reuse. So in Lemonade and previous places, we had this concept of the pawn ticket style token with URL auth. And I'm wondering in this particular case whether you have some assumption that these service provider code tokens are single time consumable, or are they something that somebody could use multiple times?
We're envisioning that it could be used multiple times.
Okay, and
Right,
the use
and
case for that is somebody has more than one device that shares a telephone number?
Right, yes. So the service provider is going to use the same token for multiple. This is how we're managing the multiple TNs, right? We're not doing it per TN. The service provider is signing all the calls with the same, token.
The token would have some time to live, as represented in the payload there. And it would be the authentication service where, like John had the picture of the intermediary. So we would assume that whatever the policy is for the time to live for that token should be based on best practices and everything else they could set up. Because the authentication service could be right now it's going to be very, it could be hours between times where it's going to get, but in the future, if we have more telephone certificates, it could be constantly getting new certificates. So the question is, does it have to get a new token for every single transaction? It's really sort of an authentication type of thing.
Yeah.
So the question is, do you need, just like in OAuth, do you have to get a token for every transaction or not?
Ted Hardy again. I think it actually would be useful to consider whether you want to do this as a classic TTL or number of instances. So maybe we can talk offline.
Okay,
about what the
no, that's a
consumption
good point.
strategy is.
We had made an assumption, which isn't documented anywhere. So yeah.
So one super minor technical point, which is that in JWT, the subfield is specified to be a string. So unless you serialize the JSON, it's out of spec to put that in there. But that kind of gets me toward what I think is a more useful point, which is that I think it would be useful to at least take a stab at defining this as a generic validation mechanism.
Well, that's right.
And for that, I think you could my hope is that it would be pretty straightforward to just say whatever the identifier type is for ACME, as long as the, we'd have to, I guess, define some matching rules between that subfield and a generic ACME identifier object.
Right. So the thing is, right now, the reason why we have it this is the same format of the field in the TN auth list, right? Which is what we were basing it on. It doesn't, there's no reason why it absolutely has to be that, but we were just, this is the format of this.
Yep.
Yeah. Chris?
The subject, the subject represents basically the TN auth list, if you know the certificates draft. So we can massage that to whatever we think. It's not really, that wouldn't strictly have to be JSON, I guess. In terms of the generic stuff, I'm supportive of that. We do have a little bit of a time frame on this. We want to make sure it's not something that takes years to all agree on a generic format, but if we feel that there's a path that's fairly efficient to get there, that would be great.
Yeah, I think we already have a generic structure for identifiers in ACME, and so I think this is just a question of how we map it into the token. So I think it can be done in a reasonable time.
Okay. Yeah. It's just then we have to. That's
Jump here, second. I just want to make sure as well in the as we genericize that those sorts of questions we were just asking about, like, okay, is this like a one-time token or like some expiries?
Exactly.
Those are things that I think different things that want a generic authority mechanism like this might skin differently. So we want to make sure that we don't bake those hard into whatever it is that we end up doing to solve this problem.
Right. And I think we're open now. If you can go back to the format, I think we've got fields in there. We've got dates and all that sort of thing, dates and times and all of that. So we can manage it that way, I think. Okay, so let's just close it. Okay, so we talked about the identifier specific to that. So we've talked about everything here. So I don't know. So if we go away from the TN auth list, then the first point is a moot point because John would not be using this mechanism for TNs, right? Or you could do it for the delegated, right? Okay. Okay, so that's fine. So we've got an action. Let's go look at the identifier, maybe change the identifier, and then we can make
Sure.
it something you can reuse as well for that case.
Yeah, we can have
Okay.
TN and SPC as separate identifiers, or we can have TN off list. It doesn't matter. But the point is,
Okay.
however we plug this, we
Yeah.
need to have it be more generic what the type of identifier
Okay, that's
is. that
fine.
you're-
That's fine. So okay. And again, Chris already brought up the point of we don't want to. We need to get this done pretty quick because people are implementing stuff right now. So we just need to get done. So, and I'll send the links to the document because there's a document that we're using and we've defined how we use it, and we will have to make some slight changes in that as we evolve this. So, okay. Any other comments? No, I think that's the last one. That's it.
It's all done.
We're done. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, so I have two drafts. One is slightly simpler and better specified than the other one. So the first one is on issuing TLS certificates for email services.
Hang on. Browser just try again.
Yeah, there is no dynamic content there, so I'm a bit anyway. The goal is to get TLS certificates for email services like SMTP submission, IMAP, POP potentially, and all other related stuff. RFC 7817, which specifies how to verify email server TLS identity, specifies two ways. One is DNS name, it's just host name where the service is running, or SRV name is a host name plus the service type, which allows for being slightly more restrictive in certificates. The idea behind this draft is it's a bit awkward to run HTTP server just to get certificate for some other service. In theory, the ACME protocol, works reasonably well for DNS name. It covers all services on the same host name, but there might be some key usage minor issues.
Do we have to take the toy away?
Yes. Okay, next slide. There are basically three options that I thought of. There might be more, this challenge thing that we just discussed might be another thing of interest. I basically took existing what they're called, verifier types, and I extended them slightly to be more specific. So for the DNS challenge, the DNS record is extended to include port number and service name. Nice property of using this scheme, you just use the DNS. You don't need to modify any email services. Also disadvantages some cases, depending who is running email service, whether it's the same team as who is running DNS, depends. Next slide. Another option is to convey the challenge inside specific protocols. Both SMTP and IMAP have capability negotiation, so we can just add an extra capability which has a string that's some encoded challenge. So it would be easy to publish some information there. Well, pros and cons, again, it's, you don't need to use DNS, but you potentially need to modify your email service implementations. Again, for somebody who is writing email service, you might prefer just to modify it or not, or Next slide. And the last option is based on service name indicator. Again, this is just a tweak on existing variant. Advantage here, this can be just done in TLS stack once and used in different services. But again, you probably, because if you don't want to restart your email service to start advertising this to ACME server, you need some way to be able to dynamically reload this information and publish them in TLS. So it's potentially a slight architecture change. Next slide. So there are 3 options. There might be more. I'm not particularly advocating that we pick one, or maybe people have preferences. I'm not suggesting that we actually try to narrow this down here, but comments are welcome. Yeah, and the other comment is, in order to accommodate service name and port attributes, I added them to the JWS token, just so that they can be conveyed in the request to ACME server.
Ted Hardy, kind of a deployment state of the art question. When somebody's running an IMAP service on multiple hosts at this point, you've gotten a group of these up. Do they typically at this point present the same certificate, or do they present independent certificates which cover the same name?
No. It depends, yeah.
Okay, in what you want to design for this, it seems like some of what you're putting forward would facilitate the first and some the second. In particular, if you wanted a different certificate for each one of the ones doing it, then each one that provided the proof using the IMAP. Okay, I'm getting a okay, so the problem with
so if they all resolve from the same A and quadruple A record, then they all can advertise
okay,
the
so
same
as long
cert.
as it's AnyCast, as long as you've proved it on one of them, they're usable, even if they're independent certificates. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't think that then helps us choose between 1 or 2. I don't particularly like 3 personally, but
to be honest, I think that it's probably slightly more interesting for small ISPs as opposed to big ones. They can hopefully afford certificates, to run, but never mind.
Petr Špaček, CZNIC. I'm the DNS person, so I would go for the DNS option because it's just easy for me. But I have a provocative question. It seems that the DANE and the self-signed certificates which are stored in, or with fingerprints stored in DNS, finally took off for the SMTP. So the provocative question is whether it's worth the hassle. For example, Comcast has just recently announced that they are going to use this. So, and they are an example of the big provider, right? So they, just don't need Let's Encrypt because self-signed certificate is just fine and it will just work. So
in theory, yes, that might be an interesting question. In practice, I don't actually know email clients who verify who will do that.
Well,
but,
the SMTP server is doing that, right? So you don't need to modify the clients. That's the nice thing. The postfix has implementation for like 2 years or 3 years enabled.
If it's self-signed certificate in DANE, then, client needs a way to
think about IMAP instead of
Okay, yeah, for IMAP, yeah, right. For IMAP, it makes more sense, yeah. But for SMTP, it might be just too late, so maybe don't bother.
And for SMTP, it's especially SMTP submission. So again, it's user-facing, MUA-facing endpoint, as opposed to MTA link. But
okay,
all right.
Paul Hoffman, I think we should deal with this because there is getting to be much more interest, especially for authenticating IMAP servers. Not as much SMTP, simply because they don't mind lies. That they don't mind being opportunistic. But IMAP servers, we are seeing more. I can't get to my IMAP server because the certificate's wrong. So I would like to see us do one. And I think option one is absolutely the best way to do it because that's the easiest for the operator to just say, okay, I just need to add this name. And the rest of everything we've already done in here is then included.
All right.
Andreas Schulze. I would prefer the second option to extend the existing protocols. As you mentioned, they have the ability to negotiate that. That would have the benefit that the broad software, the software which is in place could be updated. Takes some years, but in that case, also the smaller installation would benefit from that. The large installations don't care about it. They manage them all for themselves. But smaller installations, if they have an in-place option to configure the mail server to fetch a certificate via ACME or an IMAP server, it would give a value for many smaller instances. All the other options are broadly handled by the generic options. We have an additional HTTP server or an additional DNS authentication method. But especially for that, I would prefer to extend the protocols to support the ACME protocol.
Okay, thank you.
Russ Housley. I just wanted to come and speak against the third option. If we're going to go forward, let's do one of the other two.
Yeah, personal opinion, it does look like a bit of a hack. But
Result consistent. Out of those three options, I still think the running separate HTTP is the most useful for that. So maybe I was thinking, what if we could just decouple those two problems and be able to request via HTTP server a certificate with special usage for IMAP or other services. So and maybe even vice versa. Maybe it would be usable to prove HTTP certificate by using SMTP or IMAP server, like decouple to those two things.
Right. Yeah. The reason why I was trying not to rely on HTTP server running there, because on the same host there might be no HTTP server running. You know, it can be gateway device.
It's very simple to run it just for the one time, like the most ACME client.
Well, that's the thing, you know, there are security implications, operational implications of starting a service just to get the certificate. So,
well, better than restarting email service just to get the proof. From operational view.
Okay. That's sort of, yeah, one of the points of comparison. You have to restart the service, or you need to re-engineer it so that it can reload, that it start advertising it without restarting. So yeah, it's a trade-off.
It's Richard Barnes. Yeah, I agree that we don't need to choose just one here, and I agree that some other folks have said that 1 and 2 are much more appealing than 3. I kind of understand the appeal of 2, of defining some validation mechanisms based on the email protocols. That seems perfectly sensible here. What's unclear to me is why we need a change to the DNS validation mechanism to support this use case.
Well, I wanted to export the information about that you are getting it for specific service and port.
So
port is, you can question whether its port is useful, but at least using it, whether it's a specific service.
Well, yeah, the question is, why does the CA need to know that information? Is that reflected in the certificate somehow?
Yes, a SRV name potentially.
I see. So
it can be, but it doesn't have to be, but it can be.
Yeah, so I wonder if I wonder if maybe the approach that's needed here is to kind of define SRV names as an identifier type, kind of parallel to DNS names. Yeah, using DNS names as kind of A/quad A names,
yes,
and SRV names as, something that would correspond to an SRV name in a subject alt9 field. And then I think with that change, I think then this DNS, the option 1 here, makes sense, because you then need a way to express that information.
Okay, I'm happy to take your lead on this. Whatever structurally you think it's better.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, I sort of understand that there was a trade-off here.
Yeah, I think you don't want to adapt the existing DNS challenge. I think you want to have a new challenge that applies specifically to SRV names.
And the additional ability to specify port and service name in the name that you're looking up allows you to do multiple challenges in parallel for multiple services. So that's, you know, the existing underscore, you know, ACME challenge just doesn't, you know.
Well, I mean, you
but
can have
anyway.
multiple records, but yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
Paul Hoffman, I didn't actually expect anybody to stand up and support still using the, you know, the fake HTTP server. So I would like to speak against that for a couple of reasons. One is it's lying. And, you know, part of what we're trying to do is to validate like real things, and it's lying. It's saying, I'm the server who's going to be writing the certificate. Ha ha, no, I'm not. I'm handing it to somebody else. But the other is ACME is about trying to make things simpler. So saying, oh, you need to set up this lying server in order to get an ACME certificate, we're now pushing towards, you know, a level of difficulty that I don't think is necessary if we have any other options. But really, let's not promote the idea of lying and handing the certificate off to somebody else.
Okay. Thank you. So then I move on.
You have a plan for how to move forward now?
I think that makes it very simple. I just dropped the the TLS version.
Sure.
I mean,
I don't care what it is,
probably
I just
let's check on the mailing list. Going down from 3 to 2, I think with 2 I'm happy with, and then I'll talk to Richard about changing the DNS one maybe to the way you think is more generic.
Okay.
Right, so this is more speculative, is for getting end user certificate for SMIME. It occurred to me that it also can be used for getting client TLS certificates for authenticating to services potentially. So a lot, you know, because it verifies the same identity type. So, but that's kind of easy to change. So obviously this need new identifier type, email address, because the existing ACME identifier type is not sufficient. And then you just see my rumbling and mumbling on what kind of proof we want for the email challenge. And my current thinking is that well, we can do something similar to verification done when you subscribe to a mailing list. You know, there is some kind of challenge and response, but hopefully we can make it simpler so that it can be. Maybe there is a little bit of user action involved, but it doesn't require any changes to email clients, so you don't need to do, you know, complicated computations, insert a new header fields or anything like that. So. And then one of the question is it just sufficient to verify that the user can read email without replying? I think that's probably not, but, you know, comments?
Michael Richardson. I think these are totally reasonable assumptions. I wonder if we actually should be providing the challenge in a clearly articulated, clearly defined way, such that actually an email client could just have a button that says get certificate, and the rest of it is handled by the MUA without the user having to click on links. Is that your goal?
Sure. I mean, it can be a new media type, which is
okay. Cool.
But it probably going to include some structure in the subject just for backward compatibility.
Right. I totally, you know, right. Text multi-part blah blah blah. Give me a link because I don't have a MUA that does it. But
absolutely, yeah. Yes, sounds great.
Ted Hardy, it's so great to see people still so optimistic that SMIME deployment. This is the year of the Linux desktop. By God, I know Kathleen.
It doesn't help that
right
I probably.
Now, so yeah, I'm sure that she's also running SMIME. I really like that you're still swinging on this one, but I do have to kind of wonder to myself how much deployment this would actually see if we went to the trouble of specifying it. In particular, because if you're going to do this, and you're not going to presume that the email that you're sending it to has any way to verify that the sender, this seems to be one of those cases where there's a serious risk of, please open box with the crowbar found inside, right? That unless you have a way of cryptographically protecting the information being sent along the email path that you're going to then use for the authentication, then anybody who can read the email along the way can get the authentication. This is a store and forward protocol. Please insert years of pain here. And it really makes me wonder whether this is... Would you like to come up to the microphone and say that?
I can do it for you.
Okay.
Michael said something I would have said, which is proof of possession of the private key. This is a well-known thing that we've done for years. Just hasn't done very well because no one wants to buy certificates. Gee, wouldn't it be nice if somebody would offer free certificates?
There've been offering free email certificates for.
So to Ted, you scowled for two reasons. It seemed like one was, would anyone do this? Is it worth our work? And the other is this a safe thing to do? Let me address the first. I now work for an organization where we have to run Outlook. And Outlook comes, no, believe me. More than one hug is needed on that one on a weekly basis. And I work for an organization that has a good IT department. There are people in here who need way more hugs than I do because they have to run Outlook. You get something like Outlook, someone goes, we need to have secure Outlook, let's make them do SMIME. Yes, this would be used. And remember, part of the reason of ACME was not to make large organizations be able to get their one certificate a year for free or easily. It's for the small ones who are like, how do I do this? And believe me, all of us SMIME users, even the ones like, remember, I chaired the SMIME working group for a long time. It still sucks. We are the people for whom this would absolutely be great. So yes, it would get used by the same sort of target audience that started up ACME. Can we do it securely? Possibly. I would want to hear Russ come to the mic at least for one or two more meetings to say what we did wrong in the design, but I believe we could get a reasonable design eventually.
Okay. Ben Schwartz.
Yes, I believe we will need that one to get it right.
So on Ted's point about whether about the future prospects of SMIME, I just thought I'd mention that Google in Gmail announced official support for hosted SMIME, I think it's called, in February.
He needs a hug too then.
I need that hug. So make of that what you will. And there's also, maybe you've noticed, there's been little green lock icons showing up in Gmail and different places trying to say something about the path security of SMTP between you and the destination. That seems like it could be relevant to proof of control.
So I'd note a couple of things, hopefully with optimism. One is that we already have some protections against intermediation in ACME in terms of ACME being intermediated, because we had this idea that ACME CAs might be fronted by CDNs. So the existing challenge types have some protections against that. That's why we have the key authorization. So there may be some things we can leverage out of that to deal with the intermediation here. I was also going to point out, I'm looking, oh, John's left. Oh, well. Anyway, so it seems like this validation stuff and the SMS sort of stuff that John was talking about earlier have a lot of common properties and a lot of common risks. So it probably merits thinking about those together and following some common design patterns.
And people would like two-factor authentication potentially for this. So that
I think one thing we might be able to leverage in terms of making this a little more secure, as Ted was hinting at, is the fact that you have some existing, through ACME, you have you've already established, a binding between some entity and its private key. And so you can at least validate that the thing you are dealing with over email is the same thing you were dealing with in ACME. So I think I have slightly more hope than maybe Ted was expressing.
Okay, that's the end of my slides. Yeah, well, hackathon might be a bit optimistic, but at least on the second one. But we can maybe try it on the first one, on the service certificates. I'm also looking for some willing co-editors to help out with the burden.
I volunteer Victor Duchovny.
I don't want to make progress. Yes.
Anyway, people can talk to me offline if you want, if you're too shy. Thank you.
Okay. Recharter. Do you want to lead the rechartering? Do we need to say anything? Kathleen, we had a topic for rechartering discussion. We had previously adopted all of these documents already. We think they're in scope. I'm not sure what we need to do. Extended. Pardon me? Yeah, right.
Kathleen Moriarty, with TED.
Okay.
I didn't say it to the mic though, maybe.
Yeah.
Okay, so update the milestones, and does the charter have to be updated then?
I think so, because we circumscribed it in ways. I think we actually do need to add some of the other challenge types to the charter.
Okay, all right, great. So let me know when you're ready, and we'll get it done. Thank you.
One thing I would be interested to know in this recharter process is whether there are any CAs that are actually interested in issuing certificates of these flavors. Obviously, we can define a lot of mechanism here, but it would be nice if we could focus our efforts on things that will get deployed. I'm not sure if we have any that are in the room ready to say anything today, but I think it would be useful to have some notion of that for the working group as we. It would be useful to know if we have any CAs who are actually considering issuing certificates that would rely on any of these mechanisms. I think that has been maybe validated some for the STIR mechanisms. Yes. But, for the ACME and, for email stuff in particular, I think it's not clear to me that there's a ton of interests in that section of the market in issuing a bunch of those certificates. So it'd be good to validate that there is some interest on that side.
Paul Hoffman, I will specifically say that over the last 15 years, I've talked to CAs about SMIME certs, and they all say, we like to do them because they're regular and stuff. We just don't make that much money because advertising them, like all of our advertising budget on them is wasted. So they become smaller and smaller links on the main page. I believe if we do something with SMIME and entity certificates, there will be people who want to do it because that will then make their ability to, as long as there's pay or whatever involved, that makes their ability to renew them infinitely easier. So we may not have many, but we don't need many for SMIME. We need a couple that are well respected.
Clint Wilson.
Closer to the mic, please.
Clint Wilson, DigiCert. We do a lot of SMIME certs. Oh yeah. Holy cow. But we probably give away more than we actually sell.
Would you like to make it cheaper to give them away?
It's just ask me. You can have as many as you want. So we're still getting our heads around ACME in general and implementing it in general. So I'm not sure exactly how much interest we'd have in these, but I can say in general, we'd want to make it as easy as possible, especially once we have ACME fully implemented, to support all of our products. And so that's where we'll likely have some future work on things like code signing and document signing as well. So yes, generic interest, but not sure how specific or how useful that is.
All right. Next one, final one. Anyone have any other business?
No, that's a free mic.
I believe this is actually stepping up, not stepping down. But anyway, I want to welcome Yoav, who's taking over for me as a chair of the group. Yoav has obviously been involved with us for a very long time. And I'd just like to join everybody in saying hi.
Yes, so we went to Ted's employer and asked him what the most preferred farewell meme is, which means it just types farewell meme in Google and took the first thing that popped up in image search, and that's what it meant. So if it's too sugary and cliche, then take it up with your employer.
Actually, that graph had a line actually first up there. The first thing is actually not vertical, it's actually going left. So mathematically incorrect graph.
So Kathleen Moriarty, AD, I want to also thank you, Ted, for your work and Rich for getting the work group to this point. And thank you, Yoav, for stepping in at this point.
Go home.
Yeah, there's a slide for that. Yeah.
All right. Yeah. Blue sheets, if you haven't signed them, I don't think you came in since the meeting started. Please sign them if you have them, bring them up.
I'm afraid to open this, having watched Matt and Richard be consumed by it.
Richard was.
I don't leave till tomorrow, so. And now the ACME ride-sharing service. If anybody's going to the airport now, Mary is looking for a ride.
So, Rich, I know it's way too early for this, but